Listen.
Posłuchaj.
Écoute.
Escucha. MCO.
Listen.
MCO.
MCO.
Between the Bars.
Yannick Dondelinger here again for another episode of Between the Bars. Eat, sleep, dream, compose. George Benjamin.
I think you can't underestimate, at least with myself personally, the degree of confusion when starting at a piece. I have to find an idea which is pregnant within itself of huge possibilities, both in itself and its capacity to transform and combine and mutate into lots of other material. And more important than anything, I have to find something that I like, a sound that touches me, that means something to me, that speaks to me. And to find that, it doesn't happen every month.
Composer George Benjamin describing with impeccable honesty and clarity just how brutally challenging the process of composing a piece of music can be. You're listening to a sneak preview, fresh from the very first rehearsal, of his latest work, Concerto for Orchestra, which there'll be more of throughout this episode. Since early childhood, George Benjamin has produced dreamlike worlds of sound and story, from a mind and an imagination that have been his closest companions, through about a half-century of painstakingly figuring out the key to unlocking musical jewels that are in his mind's eye, and thus giving them to the world. This may all sound a bit much, but it isn't. As a craftsman, Benjamin has sometimes taken years to produce minutes of music, while as a listener, one can read entire universes in every bar of what he creates. He is the real deal. Sit back and enjoy as we dive into the utterly fascinating mind of one of classical music's most beloved and inspiring creators. I ask him about how he lives, how he breathes, how he feels music, and his relationship with the ensemble that Concerto for Orchestra is composed for, dedicated to, and who will finally, after a long COVID delay, present the world premiere of, with George conducting at this year's BBC Proms Festival. That will be us. A very proud Mahler Chamber Orchestra. Thank you, George.
Yeah, I'm really sorry it's over because we have just done 2 full rehearsals of my new Concerto for Orchestra about 3 months prior to the premiere at the Proms in London at the end of August. And we've done this partially because we don't have a huge amount of time in August, and this is quite a big new piece of mine and it's difficult. So your marvellous management in the Mahler Chamber Orchestra organised to assemble for a couple of sessions just to get used to the music, have it played through, for me to make a few little adjustments, and so that the music can sink in and be, as it were, quicker and easier to put together again at the end of August. And we also were incredibly, almost miraculously fortunate that the Köln Philharmonie gave us the hall for 2 sessions. So we had a marvellous acoustic with tons of space around and wonderful circumstances in which to do these 2 sessions. This is something that's never happened to me before. It's unique, and all the more unique as it's taking place in the middle, or one hopes, greatly, passionately hopes, towards the end of this pandemic. This is the first time I've picked up a baton since I was last with the Mahler Chamber Orchestra in early September last year. So I have literally not seen a musician or performed or done anything except compose in the intervening 9 months. So it's been a shock to the system, seeing musicians again, working with them and hearing something that's been locked in my mind for on the way to 2 years for the very first time. And it's extremely thrilling and mesmerizing, and my mind and my brain, I suspect, is whizzing around in all sorts of different directions at the moment.
From from my perspective, sitting in the ensemble today and yesterday, you had an intensity of focus that at times seemed almost a little bit scary. How do you view this this kind of giving birth stage of a composition?
Well, I hope I'm not. I don't intend to be scary. No, I know that how wonderful the musicians are in front of me, and I'm just trying to shape things so that my piece sounds like I want it to sound and like I imagine it sounding. The sort of level of concentration and fixing the whole attention of mind on music, on a piece of music, on a minute of music, a second of music, is what I live in while composing. The degree of depth of almost hallucinatory concentration to pick the right notes in the right place with the right rhythms and the right timbre, etc. In a way, I believe that a whole piece lives within a single beat, that a beat of a piece has to be a fragment, a portion, small portion of the whole thing. And the whole thing is made out of myriad of smaller subsections, smaller details. So the whole and the atoms are in a way the same thing. So if it seems like I'm really concentrating and wanting concentration, I suspect it comes from that. Yeah.
You have a grasp of such a concrete grasp of the landscape of your piece in your mind, whole, complete. How does it feel when such a complete picture is transferred to the outside world, from the inner ear to the outer ear, on a first playthrough, for example?
It's an extremely strange situation for me. And it's not something that happens every year because I'm far from a quick composer. My last premiere was almost exactly 3 years ago. Opera, Lessons in Love and Violence, in mid-May 2018. And here we are 3 years and 2 weeks later. The thing is that's so strange is that to create a piece, to create any piece that I write, just takes a long, long time, including an awful lot of time spent very lost and rather confused. And when what you want is extremely far from being clear, until you reach a stage where really one desperately hopes, is continuously clear, even when it's confusing in sound intentionally. There's moments where things reach overload, but all the same, I desire an extreme degree of clarity in the conception of what I'm writing, and that just takes such a long time. I mean, thousands of hours in a year, just thinking, hearing, and trying and sketching. And then you reach the stage with these lovely, wonderful musicians in front of you, and you start, and 18 minutes later you've ended. And what was revolving in my mind and in my inner ear for such a long time is no longer locked in between that small space between my two ears, physically, I mean, my brain. And it's a weird, I'm feliz as I am now after lots of activity and rehearsal, and therefore my mind buzzing, but it's a very strange, it's like you go through all the thousands of hours within a period of 18 months, 2 years, and it's compressed within 15, 18, 20 minutes. everything you've done and lived through, mainly in the previous period, is suddenly there. And it's very hard to grasp, and it's a bit scary for me. And yet it's also really, really so nice as well when bits, you get the feeling that, it's sounding like I was hoping it was going to sound. And some people are playing so nicely and interestingly that it's, that's a little bit that. I wasn't expecting that nuance there. And at the same time, I've got to be cogent and hopefully liquid and clear as a conductor for everybody, and a conductor who listens as well. So it's very demanding, and yet a great thrill. There's one thing I will add, which is that once it's been played once, even not totally precisely outside my mind, something closes. The process of the piece is forever over. And
you mean the process of the creation of
yes.
the piece? So you're giving the piece away to the...
It's gone. And I've never been able to start a new piece until this has happened. I've never been needed to, because I don't write pieces continuously. I don't start a new piece immediately after finishing another one. But this, as it were, happening now, means that I can go home and eventually, I suspect, I'll feel ready, beginning to the process of changing skin and starting something else.
Is MCO written in a way into the DNA of the work? I'm thinking maybe the title is a giveaway at this point. Is it a clear statement, calling it Concerto for Orchestra, or am I reading too much into it?
No, I think you're not. This orchestra has qualities that are absolutely exceptional in all sorts of different dimensions, but above all, thankfully, in the way that you play. And I wrote my opera written on skin for the MCO. This is my second big piece for you. There's more coming in the future as well. And there's two things about the MCO which I find just exceptional. The human quality as well. So 3 things. I like the orchestra. I like the people who run the orchestra. I like the attitude in rehearsal. I like the attitude in performance. The glow of sound of the orchestra is really something special. It's so sheerly so beautiful. Tremendous range. Can be extremely powerful as well. But there's something golden about the sound quality of the orchestra. Plus, the orchestra has a fantastic and rather incredibly characteristic degree of articulation. You can hear there's something to do with the phrasing and the crispness of every line that gives music played by the MCO a sort of zest of lime or some sort of breath of fresh air, which I also love. And when I'm composing, I can't say this is the case every single day or every week even, but behind me is the glow and the freshness of sound of the Mahler Chamber Orchestra. And yes, it seems to sustain me, and it seems to inspire me. And the fact this is called a Concerto for Orchestra, and it's dedicated to the orchestra, is one of the ways I can say thank you to what the orchestra has given me in the last decade. In fact, more than a decade. We've known each other for 13 years now.
Written on Skin. It was the first composition of yours that MCO was intimately involved with from a very early stage. It's an amazing psychological horror thriller of an opera. To me, playing it in the MCO, the music lasers its way through the mind's eye of the main characters, spilling the action into the pit. And it felt MCO was always very closely engaged with what was going on in the plot, so to speak, if that makes sense. So, but Concerto for Orchestra, it's a very different creation, being a purely orchestral composition. And I've read, I hope it's correct, that was it 2008 was the last time you wrote in this genre?
Yes, everything I've written since 2008 has involved voices. That's 2 big operas and a sort of cantata for countertenor, women's chorus, and orchestra called Dream of the Song. So yes, it's my first abstract orchestral composition in 13 years. And a concerto is different. A concerto for piano, the piece we're talking about is called Duet, and it's a miniature piano concerto with orchestra. So if we're just talking about purely orchestral music with no soloists and no stage connection, it's actually 20 years, my piece Palimpsests, since that I wrote an abstract piece for orchestra.
Right. And what are the specific challenges when of creating a work of this sort, as opposed to with an opera? There's an obvious narrative, plot, drama.
The narrative that Martin Crimp, my collaborator in my operas, gives me, not only the narrative, but the narrative techniques that he uses and the rather complex labyrinthine structures that he invents for me, which are so full of emotion and so seeped in atmosphere. They're incredibly useful for me in writing when I'm composing operas. They make me go, I've worked out something like 6 to 10 times faster as a composer. I mean, it accelerates me to an enormous degree. I love the human voice. I love setting words. So I've relished the task in the last 15 years of writing 3 operas, and I intend to write more. But there's one thing, a very useful thing, is when you're writing for the stage, it's very important that the singers are audible and the words are usually audible. And as a result, the orchestra has to be quiet a lot of the time when the singing is happening. When they're no longer there, singers, I can let the orchestra be more raucous and more active. And that is very much the case in this piece. Also, because of the absence of singers, the instrumental writing in this piece is considerably more virtuosic than anything I've done in for a long time. That was deliberate. I really wanted to enjoy the virtuosity of musicians in the foreground, playing instrumental musicians. On the other hand, the absence of plot and of words and the form of words, let alone the direction of narrative, is when you suddenly have nothing like that anymore and you really, really have a completely empty page on day one. That is something which was quite scary for me, and that was responsible for the first 9 months of composition on this piece not exactly being very productive. I didn't keep a single bar from that period.
Gosh.
And when I finished the piece in January, I also completely rewrote the first quarter or a third of the piece entirely.
Why?
It wasn't good enough.
Okay. Is that something that often happens for you? Is it part of the process? In
this precise way, no, that's never happened before.
Okay.
Every experience, every journey of a piece is different.
Yes.
And you're able to start in different places within the structure. I think you can't underestimate, at least with myself personally, the degree of confusion when starting at a piece. You say a piece of music starts with a cell or some idea. I have to find an idea which is pregnant within itself of huge possibilities, both in itself and its capacity to transform and combine and mutate into lots of other material, or else the piece won't have... A piece of music has to have cogency and coherence, and also has to have diversity and variety and contrast. And those two things don't necessarily work automatically together. And also, more important than anything than that, I have to find something that I like, a sound that touches me, that means something to me, that speaks to me. And to find that, it doesn't happen every month. And you have to keep on trying. You can't just sit around doing nothing. You just try and try and try and try and try more until something lights up in something, and then a flame is started, and there's something to work with.
To my mind, you're a composer very exacting standards. I don't think that's a secret at all. I have the impression the composition is printed in the very front of your brain while you're conducting it, even here in the Cologne Philharmonie at its first run through. But eventually, the piece goes forth out into the world and starts a life of its own. I hope it's acceptable to say that. I've always been interested in how composers react to this. What's your perspective on, I guess, giving it away to its next stage in life?
Oh, I like that lots. I like it lots. I want to conduct and tour around, not very much in the years to come. I want to be able to stay home and write more pieces. But I'd like my pieces to be heard and to be played, of course. So I like it very much as an idea, but not only as an abstract idea. When I hear my work performed under the arms and baton of people who are sympathetic of my work and capable of bringing all sorts of new facets to it, I love that as an idea. The only one thing is that if they're not either capable or sympathetic towards it, and the circumstances aren't right, and it's played not with the right spirit and not exactly with the right details, that's an experience I would do anything to avoid, because it's really, really horrid. I've heard some wonderful performances of my works in my life as a composer, and some awful ones. And the awful ones leave a mark. And so I would do anything to avoid them now.
Right.
And
so you feel very much like a parent to the piece.
Yes. And the children have to leave home as well, exactly. and go on their own road. And I don't know when I'm going to hear this piece played by someone else conducting it. I don't know at the moment, and I'd be very excited to do that, because it's a very different feeling being sat in the concert hall rather than being at the front of the orchestra. There's one thing in particular which in a way, it's a hard decision, but I like being responsible for the first performance. There's some reasons when it's good to have someone who's outside the piece, who isn't the composer. There's many reasons that would be a positive thing, but perhaps you notice I did some fine-tuning.
Yes.
Yeah,
definitely.
I've changed some dynamics.
Yes.
I even shifted one or two pitches, which I've been thinking about that I wasn't absolutely happy about. And I shifted the tempo and went back to tempo in a place, where I hadn't absolutely been certain of before. And so I was doing some fine-tuning to the actual structure, not the structure, but the stuff of the piece itself. And that could not happen if someone else was conducting, because I couldn't interfere to the same degree, and it would drive everybody, including the conductor, mad. And I think that's quite useful for the future of the piece, because it means I can just fine-tune things to get them exactly like I want them. And then I might even do a little bit more of that in London when we meet again prior to the premiere.
Having composed Concerto for Orchestra partly during COVID times, the isolation of last year is starting now to be documented and analysed. The UK, where you live, has had on occasions particularly heavy periods of lockdown. And I think the psychological burdens will be seen in a lot of cases as being heavy for people. We're after all social animals. Ironically, when I read articles that describe your own composing regime, many elements of isolation that you yourself desperately actually need to create the sound world of your music, to climb into your inner ear, for example, many of those elements are what a lot of people during COVID have considered very testing. And you can do these regimes for years, as you've described earlier in this interview. But I also understand this way of working is also taxing for you. I'm interested in what you've learned about isolation through a lifetime of being a composer, what it gives you, and maybe sometimes what it also takes from you.
Debussy said, you either compose or live, meaning that if you decide to be a composer, a very large proportion of your life has got to be spent alone, in silence, thinking, hearing, imagining. A large proportion. Doesn't mean one has no life at all. One had nothing to write if one had no life. But all the same, it does mean that one's inner world has to be fostered and lived within for long, uninterrupted periods. And that has meant that this incredibly strange and disturbing and often terrifying period of the last 16 months, that the aspect of being locked away is much more familiar to me and many of my composing colleagues than most members of the population, for whom it will have come, I suspect, as a terrible shock. Also, it depends exactly how people's lives are. If people are old and alone, it must have been really quite awful. But as it were, also, I think I am more solitary when composing than perhaps normal for a composer. I mean, I really don't go out. I don't go to concerts. I don't go to operas. I really will spend weeks and weeks and weeks. I mean, fortunately, I have a wonderful partner and wonderful family existence around me of just a few people, less than, I don't know, 8 to 9 people who I do see and sustain me and give me much happiness while I'm writing. But the outer world, they're really that almost exclusive. It's almost completely excluded. You have to, as someone who writes books or writes operas or, I don't know, paints, you have, at least in those fields, you have to learn what works when you're a solitary artist, not unlike an architect or a filmmaker. You have to learn how to get the best out of yourself, under which circumstances your muse and your imagination can work best. And I've just learned that the circumstances I've not forced myself, no one's forcing me to compose, but that I found for myself, and I just keep to them. If I have a very busy social life and a lot of contrast and seeing lots of people and going to lots of concerts, I'll never focus in on the sound world and its dreamlike quality that's required. It just won't happen. It just won't start. I just won't be able to do it. So I've had to cope with who I am and what I've given.
Does it ever feel scary being in this tunnel?
No. Scary, I wouldn't say. When it's not going well after a few months, it's not pleasant. Very far from it. And actually, the moments of sort of eureka and being thrilled are also almost non-existent. It's a question of just, as it were, devoting yourself to a task. I suppose it's a bit like being an Olympic swimmer or marathon runner, that you practice maybe early mornings 365 days a year for 2 or 3 years, and then comes the actual race or the performance. that it's all in preparation for that, and everything else is subordinate to that, at least as much as you possibly can manage. Of course, life intervenes in all sorts of ways and different ways, and you can't stop that, and you don't necessarily want to stop that. But I wanted to be a composer when I was very young, about 7 years old, and I never changed my mind. And I found this is the way in which I can write the sort of music that I want to write. And that's how it is. So I just get on with it.
And that kind of focus can be very addictive as well, can't it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think falling into pattern and habits is something that's both normal while being creative, and maybe necessary, but I don't find it addictive. Put it this way, if I'm allowed out or I break out, I'm very happy to do that. It's not addictive at all. In fact, I can't wait to reach the end of a piece, and then I can have a few weeks or months of complete freedom, because not only is this the solitude, but the other aspect of it is that the weight of the piece on one's, as it were, shoulders, speaking metaphorically, is heavy. And it's gnawing away at you all the time, almost without break, till you reach the last bar. And today, in the last 2 days, is really the final stage of that, because now we've played it. I've heard it externally, and I see that despite it being rather challenging, it actually is playable, almost all of it, I think, and it functions. So it really is closed now, and that's very, very nice to be at the end of that.
One last question. I always ask, the importance of music and live music, of course, in your life is obvious. It gives deep meaning to your talent and secures your well-being, as we talked about. And it's a major, major nourishment. But especially after COVID, what would you see as the wider importance of music, and especially live music, to people and societies?
Exactly as before, but much more intense, at least for a short period. The absence of music, live music in our world, is a terrible thing that we haven't been able to assemble, both as ensembles and as audiences, together to relish and enjoy the wonder of this art form. I watched the MCO a few hours before they came to meet with me here in Cologne, playing the most fantastic performance of Beethoven's First Symphony. I'm a composer because I fell in love with Beethoven's symphonies. They mean the world to me. They changed my life, and they found the purpose in my life. And if you'd asked me what the favourite thing in the world was for me when I was 8 years old, I wouldn't have hesitated for a half a second. It would have been Beethoven and his 9 symphonies. I don't encounter them that often now, but they mean so much to me. Yesterday afternoon's performance, which I watched on the television here in Cologne, was absolutely superb, as I'd expect from the Mahler Chamber Orchestra, brilliantly conducted by Daniel Harding. And it brought back all the love and all the enthusiasm and the sheer thrill and delight I had when I, as a child, got to know these pieces off by heart. And hearing the piece played with such freshness and such articulation and such elegance and delight yesterday. But it brought another thing to me. During the music, it fed my inner life as a child and did something that nothing else could do in the world. Nothing else could give me this burgeoning sense of inner, not peace, it's far from peaceful, it's dynamism, and it's a feeling of almost moral intensity. And Beethoven is perhaps unique amongst composers in being able to give that. And that came back to me very, very strongly yesterday. Partially it came back to me is that I haven't heard a live performance of a Beethoven symphony for a good 18 months. And I suspect you haven't played one for a good 18 months, for a long time. So this music meant a huge amount. It meant a huge amount. And I think at this hopefully, completely, we hope, pandemic conclusion, that we'll take everybody in society that likes music will take a moment to just consider how fortunate we are to have this phenomenon in our existence, how precious it is, what a glory it is, what a wonder, miracle it is that you can put so many instruments together and make them sound in rhythm and harmony to such an extraordinary degree, and value it for being such a mysterious and wonderful phenomenon. It also might speak to the hearts of a few politicians all over the world how important it is to foster and maintain this wonderful thing that we have, and how vulnerable it is, and how it could be so easily silenced, and to give it support so that it can be reborn and can foster again. And also, this gap will have cut back on that dreaded thing, routine, which is such an enemy to any form of artistic communication. So the audiences will be hungry in a way they've never known before. But also musicians will want to communicate in a different way. And maybe programming and the nature and the way that music is listened to and performed and programmed might shift a little bit as well. And that will be a healthy thing. And maybe for a few months after the pandemic is really over, there's some good will come from it.
Well, at the Mahler Chamber Orchestra, we are counting the days until we can play Concerto for Orchestra again and be at the Proms with you. And I want to say a huge thank you for agreeing to be interviewed. Thank you, George Benjamin.
Great pleasure, Yannick. Thank you.
As you just heard, the Mahler Chamber Orchestra, conducted by George Benjamin, will give the world premiere of his piece Concerto for Orchestra in London at the BBC Proms Festival, and continue on to Musikfest Berlin and Hamburg's Elbphilharmonie. Check out the MCO website for details. The Between the Bars team is changing. A huge MCO thank you to Mark Parker for all his commitment, energy and personality. He leaves us to continue life's journey of learning at Chicago Booth. And welcome Laura Thompson into the hot chair, MCO's new communications manager. From Matthias Meyer and me, Yannick Dondelinger, till next episode, keep listening.
Between the Bars.